where there'd be nepotism, and new caliphs would give positions to people within his own tribe. And in Arabia, tribal politics involved the practice of collecting plunder by conducting raids on commercial caravans, rival tribes, or settled and defenseless communities. So this tribal ideology of conducting raids on people was what informed these early attacks on Byzantium and the Persian empires. So the Arab conquest began as an extension and redirection of the old Arabian practice of plundering raids. This united the Arabs of the peninsula for the first time into a single government, and the leaders of the community sought an outlet for this tribal tension and this desire for plundering raids, and conveniently found it in the rich but weakened societies of Syria and Iraq and Byzantium. But the monotheism preached by Muhammad contributed its own imperatives. The Quran is not a squeamish book, and it exhorted the believers to jihad. There were such verses as, "Do not follow the unbelievers, but struggle against them mightily," and "Fight those who do not believe in God in the last day." The verses might have been originally directed against Muhammad's local enemies in Arabia, the pagans of Mecca or others, but they can now be redirected once a new set of enemies appeared. So whatever inspired these Arab conquerors, maybe as a way to offer plundering opportunities to them, maybe as religious zeal, maybe many other factors, the conquest must have come as a shock to the inhabitants of Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. They knew of the Arabs as nomads from the desert who had been moving in and out of the settled areas of the Fertile Crescent for centuries, and the Byzantine and Sasanian empires had maintained a client relationship with the Arab states of the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids, who were buffers between the imperial provinces and the tribes and wastes of the Arabian Peninsula. But nothing prepared citizens of cities like Damascus for the victories of the Arabs over the Byzantines at the battles of Yarmouk in Jordan in 636 and other later battles. Those are some of the reasons, cultural, geopolitical, that the Caliphate was able to conquer so much. I want to talk a little bit about weapons, and then I want to focus on the person of Khalid ibn al-Walid, because I think he really deserves some attention from us. All right, in terms of weapons, there was nothing that revolutionary happening in Arabia. Again, don't think of shimtars. Those wouldn't come till much later, those curved swords or any type of Lawrence Arabia thing. The Arab saif sword, it was very similar to the Roman gladius sword. Swords and spears were the major weapons of Muslims. I mean, really similar to Roman tactics, and we shouldn't be surprised because the Ghassanids and others had been exposed to Roman-style warfare, so they wouldn't have been ignorant of this. And their armor was either mail or leather. Don't think of long flowing robes. In northern Arabia, Roman influence predominated, and in eastern Arabia, Persian influence predominated. The Lakhmids would have been clients of the Sasanians. And in Yemen, there was Indian influence that was felt due to ancient trade routes that would go along the Indian Ocean. In Arabia, swords from India were greatly esteemed because they were considered as being made of the finest steel. Muslims were influenced by the peoples they conquered as the caliphate spread. Roman influence in Syria, Sasanian influence in Persia, and Turkish influence in Central Asia. Bedouin tribes of Arabia favored archery, but Bedouin archers usually fought on foot instead of upon horses. Horseback-mounted archery was really the forte of the Turks. The Arabs usually fought defensive battles with their infantry archers that were placed on both flanks. By the time we get up into the Umayyad period, in the late 7th century, the Caliphate had a standing army, with an elite force being raised from the Arabs who settled in Syria. The Caliphate was divided into a number of regional armies stationed in the provinces that were made mostly of Arab tribes who were paid money by the war ministry. So that's partly how the military was constructed. Nothing too shocking there. Now, I want to focus on an exemplary figure, Khalid ibn al-Walid, because I think he's an extremely important reason why Islam was able to spread. Historians these days, I think, are a little bit squeamish, rightly so, of using a great man theory of history, that history is moved by one or two exemplary individuals. Social theory loves to look at larger structural factors in society that explain why wars are won or lost, why one civilization might rise up compared to another one. And that makes sense. I think that the Syrian and Persian lands being depopulated goes a long way of explaining why Islamic civilization was successful, why Muslim armies were successful. But really, sometimes you can't ignore exemplary figures. Are we going to ignore an Alexander the Great or a Hannibal of Barca and just say that, oh yeah, the Macedonians would have definitely conquered Persia and gone all the way out to India if it hadn't been for Alexander? I don't think so. That's why I think Khalid ibn al-Walid deserves attention. So Khalid ibn al-Walid, who was dubbed the Sword of God by Muhammad, had a strange relationship with the Islamic religion. On the one hand, he was directly responsible for its explosion out of the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century. He led its armies in the conquest of Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, and Syria, oftentimes against superior forces. Khalid never lost a battle in his decades-long career. He even destroyed the Persian Empire and crippled the Byzantine Empire. His tactical successes at the Battle of Yarmouk and Walaja by the use of mounted warriors proved him to be one of the greatest cavalry commanders in history. He was commended by an officer who said, "No man is his equal in war. No people face Khalid in battle, be they strong or weak, but they are defeated. Take my advice and make peace with him." But his success also made him a paradoxical figure in the religion of Islam's infancy. The commander was the only general ever to lead a force that defeated Muhammad's army in combat. This defeat threatened to undercut Islam at its birth, since Muhammad often substantiated his claims to prophecy by his military success as proof of God's blessing. The paradox was resolved by Khalid's conversion to Islam following a truce after the Battle of Uhud, and these were battles that Muhammad fought in the Hijaz to consolidate his control over the early Muslim community. But Khalid's dazzling victories under the reigns of Caliph Abu Bakr and Umar made both men fear that he would undercut them and possibly gain enough popular support to wage a rebellion. Umar resolved his fears by stripping the general of command and discharging him from the military. Khalid spent his so-called retirement and the rest of his career as a foot soldier, smashing swords through his opponents in pitched battle. So Khalid's command record includes victories in over 100 battles and 0 defeats. His conquest spread a new religion beyond its Arabian beginnings and into Persian and Byzantine lands, biting off enormous chunks of land from the world's 2 most powerful empires. Equally as important, Khalid ibn al-Walid was a brilliant strategist who was never hesitant to battle a larger force. So there's a lot we could say about him, but let's jump to some of his most important victories. This is in 633 during the reign of Abu Bakr. This is after Abu Bakr reconsolidates control over the Arabian Peninsula in the Ridda Wars when tribes are starting to break away. So after the Ridda Wars are over, the elderly caliph turned his gaze outward toward his powerful neighbors, toward Byzantium and the Sassanid Empire. In 633, he put Khalid in charge of the caliphate's campaign in the lower Mesopotamian area of the Persian Empire. Khalid led a force of 18,000 soldiers to capture Sassania's richest provinces. Khalid met little resistance among the Iraqis, who realized that they would fare better as Muslim subjects rather than Persian subjects, and greeted them as liberators. These Arabs who lived on the Persian borderlands weren't Persian themselves, and there was no major love lost to the Sassanian Empire. One of Khalid's most famous victories came at the Battle of Walaja in 633. Khalid faced a Persian army reinforced by Arab allies. The total number is at least 3 times the size of his own army. In order to fight them, he used his cavalry and implemented a variation of Hannibal of Barca's famous double entrapment maneuver, which he used in the Second Punic War, and he surrounded the enemy as it advanced and then crushed it with 2 flanks. This is an extremely difficult cavalry maneuver. You have to have very well-trained forces and time things perfectly. And this was only the second time in history that this extremely difficult maneuver was successfully executed. Military historians think that Khalid developed his own maneuver independent of Hannibal, as there's little chance he was familiar with Roman military history. After Walaja, Khalid won the Battle of Ulais in May of 633. Later that month, the Persian capital of Lower Mesopotamia fell. Khalid then laid siege to Anbar, which was not nearly as easy to conquer due to heavy resistance from the inhabitants. In the end, Khalid broke the siege by using Muslim archers to force surrender. So at this point, he'd conquered much of the northern Euphrates region. Khalid was next ordered to conquer Byzantine Syria. This was indeed a tall order. The historical area in question is much larger than the present-day nation of Syria, and its domains included the modern-day nations of Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, and southern Turkey. Khalid's army was composed of 23,000 soldiers led by 4 generals. The army marched city by city in small battles. Khalid then began a 3-day march through the mountains towards Damascus. Khalid was held up because he had to assist a commander along the Syrian-Arab border who requested emergency reinforcement. So Khalid needed to enter Syria at this point from Iraq. And entering it directly was very difficult because you had to pass through the Syrian desert. The army had to go through because it didn't have enough time to stock up on adequate provisions for the march. As a result, tradition says that soldiers walked 2 days through the Syrian desert without any water. They finally reached an oasis, but they didn't have any means of carrying water with them, and if they would have continued onward, then they would have died of heat stroke. But Khalid, who was well acquainted with Bedouin culture, used a method known among the desert traversing traders to carry water in the most dry parts of the desert. Here's what they did. The army had a lot of camels on hand, who were the pack animal of choice in the desert, and each one could drink dozens of gallons of water in minutes, and were capable of storing 50 gallons at a time. Shortly after drinking, they were also capable of storing fresh water in their stomachs, making them walking water storage devices. Now, it's not as if camels store water in their hump. Their humps actually store fat, and this fat then converts to water, and that's how they're able to go for so long in the desert without any water. So it's not like somebody was just putting a spigot in their hump, and that's where water came from, but shortly after they drank water, they had some in their stomachs. Anyway, the armies resumed their march to the desert, and then slaughtered camels as their thirst required, and drank from the contents of their stomachs. That's what the tradition says, at least. The army arrived in Syria in June 634 and immediately captured border towns. The Byzantines did not expect them to arrive from the desert. Khalid then proceeded to Basra, where he fought against 12,000 Byzantines. When Khalid's 9,000 soldier army arrived, the Byzantines retreated to the city's castle. After a siege, they returned to the battlefield and were defeated. Then, over 90,000 Byzantine troops gathered at Ajnadain, where they were defeated by 20,000 Muslim forces. This was the tipping point that signaled the end of Byzantine power in Syria and the coming dominance of Islam. Before the battle began, a Christian bishop attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Khalid, in response, offered the traditional Islamic terms prior to battle or city siege: surrender, conversion to Islam, or agreement to pay the jizya, an Islamic poll tax administered to non-Muslims. And it should be noted that this is only a slight variation of the terms of typical ancient warfare, where if you were to put a city under siege, the city could surrender, and if they didn't surrender and you conquered them, then men would be killed, women and children would be enslaved, and the city would be plundered. This is a traditional custom of warfare that goes well into the Middle Ages. Well, the bishop refused. As both forces assembled into battle formation, Khalid told his forces, including his archers, to show restraint. The battle commenced with skirmishes between individual troops, which was an advantage for the Muslim army. After 3 days of heavy fighting, the Byzantines finally retreated with the Muslim cavalry in pursuit, which killed more soldiers than the battle itself. The final tally of casualties was 450 Muslims and 70,000 Romans. Well, the Roman Emperor Heraclius realized that the local forces in Syria were not sufficient to repel the Muslims, and that he needed to deploy the elite imperial army. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Khalid continued his campaign of Byzantine conquest and set his sights on Damascus. He defeated the Emperor Heraclius' son-in-law, Thomas, at the Battle of Yokosa, and won the Battle of Miraj al-Safar. On August 20th, 634, he reached Damascus, where he defeated the Byzantines. The Byzantines abandoned the city, but the Muslim cavalry caught up with them and slaughtered them again in a rout. In late spring of 636, Khalid received word from captured Byzantine prisoners that Heraclius was assembling a major campaign to take back Syria. The emperor had consistently underestimated Khalid and the Muslim armies, hoping to avoid large pitched battles by isolating small Muslim forces. A full-scale head-on battle was now decided as the only plausible course of military action. The Muslim leaders gathered to plan a counter-strategy. They followed Khalid's advice to